Hi, everyone, and welcome to this talk about the truth around menopause. This is looking at what is happening in perimenopause, at menopause, and even postmenopause through an Ayurvedic lens, and also talking about some of the Western protocol or medical protocol around hormones and hormone replacement therapy, some of the risk factors, and then some of the alternatives in natural health and healing and the wisdom of Ayurveda. So I was inspired to put this talk together for women, all women, um, because my most recent visit to my gynecologist, my annual visit, um, she said, "Well, when you get to that point," because we were talking about perimenopause and menopause, when you get to that point, you're going to want estrogen and progesterone. And I thought, what an interesting thing to say. What an interesting way to say, or sort of put you know, a projection onto someone and say what you're going to want. How would you know? And so I thought, I'm probably one of those people. I stopped her and I said, I'm probably one of those people that, that's not what I would like at this point in my life. I don't know what I'm going to want at that stage in the game, but I'm hoping that I won't need those things. And she said, well, you want them, at least the estrogen for your bones and your heart. And then I thought, oh my gosh, there are so many Ayurvedic and just general healthy natural lifestyle practices that we can take up and adopt before menopause, or even while we're going through this transition and well into postmenopause, that will help with our heart and our bones. I mean, exercise, right? Weight bearing exercise for one. So then I thought, well, why are doctors giving this information instead of some of these natural alternatives, or maybe alongside them? And she did give me some, said you'll want to start doing some weight bearing and exercise, and things I already knew. But I also thought, wow, how many conversations like this are happening, and how many women know about all of the things, that all of the options they have aside from hormone replacement therapy. And then I thought, wow, there's so much that Ayurveda teaches us about balance, and what this part of life is, what's really happening, even on a sort of a deep emotional and spiritual level, that I think is really important for women to know. And then there's this great book that I'll send you guys in the materials after, along with this recording, after class. By Dr. Claudia Welch, called Balance Your Hormones, Balance Your Life. And I'm pulling a lot of information from her book, because she gives such detailed and thorough and um, really interesting explanation around hormones, what's actually happening in our bodies. And what I really want to convey, one of the big points I want to convey in this talk, what your body is equipped to do in or after menopause. You can still produce sex hormones. You can still produce estrogen, as long as leading up to, or when you realize there's an imbalance, things get corrected, things get adjusted, and we start to live a more balanced lifestyle. And Ayurveda gives us these amazing tools to do that with. So, without further ado, we'll jump into the material, and we'll talk about, first, I just want to give sort of a quick intro, like a crash course into Ayurveda for those who have never heard of it, are new to it, or maybe are just starting to learn about it. And so this is part of our quick intro to Ayurveda. What is Ayurveda? So Ayurveda is a Sanskrit word, the language from India, one of the oldest known languages, that means life science. Ayur means life, Veda means science. And Ayurveda is often referred to as the sister science of yoga, because they developed alongside one another out of Vedic wisdom, or this body of knowledge that eventually became written down, that comes from the area we now know as India. And Ayurveda is one of the oldest known forms of medicine, and it's thought to be over 5,000 years old. The science of Ayurveda looks at the root cause of disease, versus we check out symptoms to give us a clue. as to what the root cause of disease is, versus allopathic medicine, which only treats symptoms. So Ayurveda treats the root cause of disease. And this gives us the ability to heal, to put the body in its most optimal state for doing what it's supposed to do, which is heal. And so we look at all of these unique characteristics that everyone has. And this, we'll talk about this in a moment, is called prakruti. It's another Sanskrit term for you. And one of the basic tenets in Ayurveda is that all disease begins in the digestive tract, right? So we have a few different causes of disease. Some are psycho-spiritual, some are about our habits, our choices, our mindset. But in the physical realm, disease begins in the digestive tract, or health. All disease or health begins in the digestive tract. So our digestion is very important. And these are things that Western medicine are starting to talk about, that modern science is starting to prove around the microbiome. And Ayurveda helps us find this balance that we're seeking, especially in this talk tonight about our around our hormones. It helps us find our natural rhythm by looking at our seasonal routines, our daily routines, the routines that we're starting to shift around aging, and then we try to find this balance by looking at nature and aligning ourselves with the rhythms of nature. And so this informs what we eat, our diet, what we do, our lifestyle, our mindset, our approach to life, and all of these beautiful daily practices that Ayurveda and yoga can bring to our lives. And this helps with harmony, balance, and ultimate health and well-being. So the five great elements are called Pancha Mahabhutas in Sanskrit. The five great elements are sort of the overarching concept that Ayurveda and Ayurvedic medicine is based around. So each of the five elements represents a quality in our bodies and then also in our minds. So earth is all about structure, our tissues. Right? So earth represents the structure of our bodies, our bodily tissues, and then also our stability of the mind, right? Our sense of feeling grounded. Water is all about moisture in general, and then in the body, it's very much about the tissues that hold a lot of water. So lymph, interstitial tissue. Lymph is the watery component of the blood, and in the mind, it's all about our emotional and creative flow. So creative energy. And then fire. Fire is all about transformation. So in the body, it's our metabolism. And we're usually talking about the fire of our digestion, of our digestive system, as you can imagine in Ayurveda, because all health or disease begins in the digestive system. And then in the mind, it's all about clarity. It gives us this light to move forward and see clearly, to know what our next step is, or to manifest our deepest desires. And then air, in general, is all about movement. And in the body, it's the movement of all of our limbs, our digestive organs, our eyes, our speech, any movement of blood, movement of the heart, the lungs as they uh, create respiration, right? Breathing. And then in the mind, it's all about inspiration and the movement of our thoughts. So, movement of thoughts in the mind. And then ether. Ether is space, right? It's the void. But in the mind, it's all about connection, connectivity. And you can even think of it as like if people have a lot of ether in their constitution, or their what we call prakruti in Ayurveda, then they're able to sort of connect to the collective consciousness, or like the quantum field, and pull things out of the air, right? They're very creative. And ether, I'd like to spend just a few more seconds on, because ether is such an interesting element, and it's easier to understand what it does or how it is when it accumulates. And so as we age, ether actually accumulates in our body and our mind. And what ether does when it accumulates is it diminishes all of these other elements. And so as we age, ether accumulates and it diminishes our tissues, right? So as we age, we get thinner hair, thinner skin, thinner bones, sometimes a less stable mind. And so ether's an interesting thing to look at as we progress throughout our life. And we'll talk about what that means for our hormones and what that means around menopause. So the five great elements combine to form what are called three doshas. Doshas, you may have heard of if you know anything about Ayurveda, if you've looked into Ayurveda even cursorily, you may have heard about the doshas. And these are biophysical forces that govern our world, our bodies, and our minds, just like the elements, right? Because they're made of the elements. And so all of us have all five elements, and all of us have all three doshas, but they're in different combinations depending upon your DNA, right? What your inherited traits, and maybe even the things that you have accumulated over a lifetime of learning, of acquiring, belief patterns, lifestyle patterns, etc. So the doshas determine our physical makeup and our mental tendencies. They are called vata, pitta, and kapha. So before we jump into Vata Pitta Kapha, I want to spend just a few moments on Prakruti. I've mentioned the word before. Pra means pre, and Kruti means creation. So before creation, Prakruti is the unique combination of the elements or the doshas with which each of us come into the world. And we look at our facial features, our body structure, right? Like things I mentioned just when I was talking about ether, bone thickness, hair traits, skin traits. We look at all of these features in our structure and then our long-term digestive, metabolic, and psychological tendencies. So our elimination patterns, our digestive patterns, sleep patterns, the menstrual cycle, our reaction to stress. Um, and so we look at all of these things to find our prakruti, how we came into the world. And so knowing what our prakruti is can help us learn what foods, what practices, and what habits support our long-term health and disease prevention. And then we have Vikruti. V is after, Kruti again is creation. So Vikruti is what's going on right now. What's out of balance? And so we find our Vikruti by looking at all of our health complaints, right? So let's talk about things around perimenopause and menopause: constipation, reflux, anxiety, hot flashes, fatigue, brain fog, weight gain, right? All of these things are what's out of balance right now. What's the current state of affairs right now? And based on the qualities of those symptoms, what elements are we seeing? What doshas are we seeing? Then we apply opposite qualities through our food, our scents, right? Like aromatherapy, colors, chromotherapy, body therapies, sounds, right? What we're listening to, and practices. And these practices are found in yoga, like asana, right? The physical practice, pranayama, breath work, meditation, focusing the mind, among many other beautiful body practices that Ayurveda offers us. And we're going to talk about several of those tonight. So no matter what your prakruti is, no matter how you came into the world, we always want to work on what's out of balance. And this is where, if you've taken dosha quizzes, they can get a little confusing, because they might not separate how you've been for a long time or where you are when you're in balance versus what's going on right now and what is out of balance and what needs to be worked on. So even if I'm a really pitta person, I have a lot of fire, you might have a different imbalance. It might be vata that's going out of balance for you. It might be vata and your pitta that's going out of balance for you. So it's really important to know what is out of balance and focus on that. So vata dosha, let's talk about this first dosha. It's made of air and ether. So it's the driest, the lightest, the coldest, the most mobile, right? It moves a lot like the air, the wind, and the most unstable of the doshas. So if you have more vata in your prakruti, you came into the world with more vata, you might have more of the features and the tendencies that are considered vata in nature. Okay. You're going to have a combination, most likely, of different features to some degree, but there's probably one that dominates for you, or there might be two that dominate for you. Okay. So for vata individuals, people who have a lot of vata, they're going to have thinner bones, thinner hair, thinner skin, smaller features, smaller eyes, smaller nose, smaller lips, and kind of more elongated features sometimes. So longer bones, longer fingers, longer, more sinewy muscles, and they tend toward dryness. okay, in general for all of their tissues. Their digestion is going to be more variable. So they're going to have a variable appetite. They tend to forget to eat. They get really lightheaded. They have kind of like a hyper or hypoglycemic reaction to fasting. They tend toward gas, bloating, and either constipation or maybe alternating constipation and diarrhea when they get out of balance, right? So things are really dry and sort of variable. And then when they finally go, it's just sort of, it opens the floodgates, but then they get all dried out. Right. And so it kind of starts all over again. Their hormones tend to be variable as well. And that can cause irregularity in their menstrual cycle and PMS or premenstrual syndrome that involves a lot of pain. Vata is always associated with pain and mood swings, variability. I always say V equals V. So if you see variability, think V, Vata. And then they'll have fertility challenges typically. Now, this doesn't mean that somebody who has a lot of Vata couldn't get in balance and get more regular. Absolutely. But when they go out of balance, this is where they tend to go. Okay. Now, can a Kapha person or a Pitta person have these kinds of hormonal imbalances or a Vata hormonal imbalance? Absolutely. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. So now we have Pitta, I'm sorry, we're still looking at Vata dosha, and these are more of like the mental tendencies. So they're very creative, but when they get out of balance, they can get very fearful, worried, and anxious, and this might lead to depression, right? They see all the possibilities, so they're kind of always projecting themselves into the future. What if, what if, what if? And when that really gets going, when the air really gets going and the thoughts really get moving, that can start to produce some fear and worry and anxiety and overwhelm. Overwhelm is a very common Vata tendency. So, or a sensation, right? Or experience. They have a hard time finishing projects, but it's very easy to start. All that creativity. They love new things, they love change, but it's hard to follow through. It's hard to focus enough to follow through. They love that change, they love to move and fast. And so, again, it's hard for them to focus. They might be considered overly sensitive, right? They have insomnia when they're out of balance, hyperactivity when they get out of balance, right? They're very sensitive to sound and smell and taste and what they're looking at, right? So all the sensory input, or maybe even touch when they get really out of balance. Personality wise, they're very enthusiastic. They're very talkative. They love to make new friends. Sorry, I have a very sensitive mouse here. They love to make new friends and make connections, right? With that ether element. And they're very much a cheerleader for others, right? They're very encouraging to their friends and coworkers and loved ones. Metabolic wise, they're since they're so dry, they don't sweat very much. It's hard to gain weight because of that variable digestion, and they typically are very cold natured, especially their hands and their feet. Okay. So that's Vata. And then we've got Pitta. Pitta is made of fire and a little bit of water. Some of the Vedic texts say just fire. Some say a little bit of water because you have to have some water to contain the fire, right? And for Pitta people, that water element could show up as kind of like an oiliness to their skin or maybe their scalp. So they're moist or oily, they're light, but they're hot and they're mobile, right? So they have some of the same qualities of Vata. They're light and mobile, but they tend to be more stable and definitely warmer. So those with more Pitta in their Prakruti, right, how they came into the world, they have features and tendencies that are considered more Pitta in nature, or that's maybe what's going to dominate for them when you look at their overall physical or mental and emotional tendencies, metabolic tendencies. So they're very moderate. Their bones, hair, skin, kind of all in the middle. Eyes, nose, lips, right? All their features kind of in the middle. The bones, fingers, muscles in the middle. They produce, moderate tissue because they've got pretty strong digestion. Because of all that fire, they're able to metabolize their food and turn it into tissue without much of a problem. And they burn off the excess with energy because they love to, as we'll talk about in a second, they're pretty intense, right? They like to work. So they tend toward a little bit of oiliness. But interestingly, when Pitta has been going on for a long time, that fire's been burning for a long time, it can dry out all that oil or that water. So Pitta can get dry over time and kind of start to look like Vata. Digestion wise, again, strong appetite. They don't forget to eat, but they might eat while they're working, right? They're going to eat at their desk. They're going to be really productive. and they get kind of hangry when they're or really hangry when they skip meals. So they like to eat regularly. That's something they don't typically skip meals unless they are really engrossed in work and it's there's a big deadline coming up looming over them. They tend more toward like burning digestion and loose stool when they get overheated. So the body's way of releasing heat is to release waste. So when they get hot, right, their bowel movements are really getting efficient toward like looser stool or even diarrhea. And they get a burning in their like heartburn, right? When they get really intense and when that fire gets going. Their hormones tend to be pretty steady. And so they have pretty regular menstrual cycles, pretty mild PMS, not a lot of pain, doesn't really bother them. And their periods are kind of like intense, with all of that fire. So kind of intense, but not too long, pretty moderate, just like they are. Mentally, emotionally, they like to lead. They're pretty competitive. They're intense. They can be judgmental and critical, and that can lead to anger when they get out of balance. Project wise, pretty easy for them to finish because they're very goal oriented and competitive, even with themselves. They're very clear, know how to move forward and finish things. They like order. They have a really easy time focusing. They might be considered overly intense or overly critical, right? Especially toward those Vata people who tend to be a little overly sensitive. They tend toward pretty steady sleep, but they might like to burn the midnight oil, right? They might be those night owls because that's where they're getting a lot of work done, or they just like to keep working. Personality wise, they're very warm, they're very clear. They can prioritize work over socializing. They might be those workaholics, and they tend to be a leader for others. They like to lead. So metabolically, they sweat very easily, and that sweat might have a very sharp odor. Fire has a very sharp quality to it. Their speech might even be kind of sharp, right? That where it gives that sense of being overly critical or judgmental. Typically, just like their tissue, their weight is pretty steady and moderate, easy to maintain, easy to lose if they need to, and they're very warm, right? They're like that furnace when they're sleeping. They emit a lot of heat. So now we have Kapha dosha finally, made of earth and water. So it's the heaviest of the doshas, most solid. Remember, earth is all about structure and our tissues and stability. So they're moist, they're heavy, they're cool, and they're stable or a little slow. So if you have more kapha in your prakruti, you will have more kapha features. So thicker bones, thicker hair, thicker skin, larger features, eyes, nose, and lips, full lips, thicker bones, maybe shorter, thicker fingers and appendages, thicker, denser muscles. You might, feel like you bulk a little more when you build muscle versus get something sharp or chiseled like pitta, or just have a hard time building muscle in general, like vata. They have very soft, smooth tissues with innate moisture, and they could be prone to swelling. Digestive wise, their appetite's pretty low because of all that earth and water. So fasting feels great. And they tend toward heaviness, nausea, and bloating in the digestive system, even if they only have a little extra food. Right? It's very easy for them to overeat. So they've got to keep the food on the minimal side and time between eating pretty lengthy. Hormone wise, they're strong and steady. So they've got a really regular menstrual cycle, longer periods though, and maybe a little mild PMS that's more about, not so much about pain, but more about like bloating, swelling, breast tenderness, right, in those lymph nodes. And they have very strong fertility, usually pretty easy to conceive, these couple people. Mentally, emotionally, they love to nurture. They feel things very deeply, but they're pretty go with the flow, easygoing like water, and they're steady and they're stable like that earth element. They take a longer time to do things, right? They prefer to let other people start projects and then they'll sort of like, they'll see it through and support everybody. They're your support staff. They're like your HR team, right? They love comfort. They love routines. They could be slow to understand information, but once it's in there, their mind is like a steel trap and they can recall it really well. They're the memory keepers. They might be considered stubborn or stuck in their ways when they get out of balance, right? And they tend toward very deep sleep. Personality wise, again, pretty easygoing. They might be a little shy or quiet. They like to form deep, lasting relationships. They go deep fast, right? And in the conversation. and they're a support for others. They're a shoulder to cry on and lean on. Metabolically, they take longer to sweat, but they have all that innate moisture. So it's a lot. There's a lot of sweating happening whenever they do finally sweat. And typically their weight is easily gained. But honestly, most Kappa people, they've kind of figured out the game around food and overeating. So they're pretty steady with their weight. Um, and then they're very cool natured. So unlike Vata, Vata is just cold, but Kapha is pretty cool. Their skin might even feel a little cool and clammy, kind of moist because of all that water element. Temperature fluctuations doesn't really bother them because they're so well insulated, right? Their tissue is just thicker. The extremes don't really bother them. So this is important, these kapha, these doshas, kapha, pitta, and vata, because we go through the kapha time of life, pitta time of life, and vata time of life. Everybody does. Kapha time of life is childhood through puberty or birth through puberty, right? We're growing all this tissue. We're got a lot of earth, a lot of water element coming in. And tissues are produced by our hormones. And then in turn, our tissues can help produce hormones, especially um, at menopause and beyond. And then pitta time of life is the fiery time of life. We're producing, we're accumulating wealth, right? We're producing product, work product, but also children, if that's your choice in life. So it's our fertile time for not just children, but work product, right? And again, creating things. And our tissues are sustained by our hormones at this time in life. Okay. And then we have vata time of life, and that's where we are at menopause. Okay, we all hit the vata time of life around menopause. It's around the same age range for men, and even though they don't experience menopause, they do experience a gradual decline in testosterone. It's not as sort of seemingly sudden as our drop in estrogen, and this is until we die, right? So this is where we're transitioning from our productive years to our wisdom sharing years. So naturally, we're asked to slow down, and our tissues gradually over time, right, not at right at menopause, but over time, the next several decades, they gradually become depleted by the forces of vata and time or aging, right? We sort of go back to the ether, we go back to where we came from. So it's important to understand this distinction because um, we tend to fight this time of life, right? Our society, our culture has a lot of what they might consider norms or expectations around this time of life. And now Ayurveda is saying it's time to slow down. It's time to transition. It's time to really step into your wisdom. All this experience that you've accumulated over your productive years, right? Doesn't mean you're not going to still produce and still be creative, but we're shifting. And when we fight that, that's, I believe, sort of the psycho-spiritual cause of a lot of our problems that we have around menopause and all of these symptoms that we have just started dreading, right? So much so that doctors are telling us, don't worry, we can throw some hormones at it. You're going to want this, right? And so I'm arguing you don't have to go that route if you don't want to. There's no judgment. I don't want to create fear around hormone replacement therapy or sort of taking an allopathic route. But I do want everybody to know there are so many other things you can do here. And let's start just by looking at what's going on from an Ayurvedic perspective. And then let's talk about our hormones and what's going on there. So there's this idea in Ayurveda that the faster we move, the faster we age. And if you know about Vata, made of the air element, which is all about movement, and that we accumulate Vata as we age, and that we enter the Vata time of life around menopause, then the faster you move, the faster you get there. So, and the more Vata you have when you arrive. So, this is like Vata pushing Vata, right? So, coupled with the accumulation of, so any transition in life involves air element, whether we're just, like changing our clothes because we're moving, right? We're moving the body, changing jobs, which is a big change, changing our status, right? From single to partnered or coupled, um, or just changing from one grand stage in life to the next, right? Maybe just retirement, menopause. These are big shifts. So there's always air there. And then we accumulate that vata and that air and ether as we age. this Vata time of life can be pretty difficult, especially if you came into the world with a lot of Vata or your Vata's out of balance right now. And so Vata gets really aggravated and out of balance and high with stress, right? All that fear and that worry and that overwhelm and anxiety, all those Vata symptoms, and then any sort of external or internal demands placed upon us. So if you've got more Vata in your Prakriti or your Vikruti, you're going to have more Vata symptoms during this Vata time of life. And those are gas, remember, bloating, constipation, dryness, depletion of tissues, right? Maybe loss of tissue like bone tissue or muscle tissue. And your mental faculties are going to be affected, right? So maybe some brain fog, anxiety, overwhelm, insomnia, your nervous system is going to be affected by all that air, ether, and Vata. People who have more pitta, right? Those workaholics, those overachievers, those people who burn the candle at both ends, they might actually experience more Vata type symptoms too. Because remember, when pitta, that fire's around a long time, it burns up all of their moisture, all of their water. So it burns up their tissues, it burns up their sex hormones and their ojas. And we're going to talk about ojas. It's your ability to withstand stress. So Vata dries it up, pitta burns it up. So the pitta people might really get some Vata symptoms coming around this time of life too. Kappa, maybe not so much. They might be the ones who are breezing through menopause, and we don't really understand why. um, and because they just have more earth and water, more ability to withstand stress, and more hormonal balance in general, just because of their tendencies, right? So, but the Kappa people could experience these symptoms as well, especially if they've been availing themselves of the type of lifestyle choices that aggravate, right? And create a lot of stress. And like we'll talk about a lot of cortisol production, stress hormone production. So um, we want to be careful with how much vata we are accumulating in our pre-menopause, right? Our perimenopausal, and even before that, phases of life. Because if not, if we move too fast, like I said, we might end up at menopause earlier or faster, but we'll definitely end up there more depleted and with fewer resources to sustain our tissues. So we'll talk about that. So I wanted to talk about ojas. I mentioned it just a moment ago. Ojas, it's the Sanskrit word, and in Ayurveda, we're talking about our resiliency, our ability to withstand stress, our hormonal balance, really. Um, and Ojas is the antidote to accelerated aging. And so when we have this abundance of ojas, we have balanced hormones, we have an ability to withstand stress, we get sick less often, our immune system is better, and we tend to live longer. Kappa people tend to come into the world with more ojas in general, right? So kappa, if you have more kappa in your constitution, you might have more ojas too. You might have the ability to withstand stress. You're that steady rock. Your hormones are more balanced. Kappa people tend to live longer. Kappa people tend to get sick less often. So kappa and ojas tend to go together. How do we build ojas? How do we build, more of this earth and water? Through creating healthy tissue, right? So we've got to work on our digestion and make sure that we produce healthy tissue, because at the end of the tissue chain, Ayurveda says, we build ojas, right? So if we're producing, this is the order Ayurveda says we produce tissue: lymph, then blood, then muscle and skin, then fat, then bones, then nerves, then reproductive tissues. So not only are reproductive tissues at the end of the chain, ojas is at the end of the chain beyond that. So that's why it's a little tougher, trickier to work with reproductive imbalance, hormonal imbalance, than it is to um, affect, let's say, your cardiovascular system with exercise, or your build muscle with exercise, or build fat, right? If we're storing things we're not burning off during exercise, or heal a bone, right? But if we can do all these things and create healthy tissue leading up to the reproductive tissue and then ojas, then we're going to be okay. So it all starts in the digestive system, because we build healthy tissue, we build a healthy um, a healthy container for our hormones to be in. So if we work to preserve and build our ojas and balance our doshas, especially pitta and vata, especially vata, then the transition into this phase of our lives can be really natural, really gradual, really easeful. In fact, all these imbalances and symptoms that we consider as just sort of a quote normal part of menopause, they're not. They're not normal. um, you know, um, so many areas of the world, menopause is not the thing that it is in the West. It's starting to change though, right? Because a lot of people are adopting more Western way of living. And that's starting to encroach upon some of these cultures where people are very aligned with the rhythms of life and the rhythms of the day and the rhythms of the seasons. And not so much in the Western world, right? We really like to push and fight against our nature and sort of, um, right? We're trying to stay young and youthful with this false sense of what that really means or what that's all about. So, our bodies are naturally equipped to continue producing the appropriate amount of sex hormones to see us through until death, as long as we respect and care for our energy and our tissues. Okay, we're going to talk more about all this. And first, starting with how to build ojas, we're going to talk about these things in more depth around what to do to take care of our bones, our heart, and our breasts post menopause. But suffice it to say, these are just sort of an outline of how we build ojas. So we eat fresh, seasonal, and nourishing foods in the appropriate amount, right? Based on how well we digest food. So kapha a little bit, pitta the most, and vata maybe somewhere in between, and in the appropriate way. We're going to talk about guidelines for healthy eating, and I'm going to send you guys a handout on that to help build disease-free tissue, right? So we eat for our vikruti or our prakruti. We eat for pitta or vata or kapha, depending upon what's out of balance, what's coming up at that time. And we'll talk about that in a moment. We want to do self oil massage. This is a really beautiful Ayurvedic practice, and it helps preserve every layer of our tissue. It also gives us self love and turns on feel good hormones, just like getting a hug. And we'll talk about that too tonight. We spend time in nature. We align our biorhythms with the sun and the moon so that we get quality sleep, right? 7 to 9 hours of sleep every night if we can. Or we make up for it by getting structured rest during the day. And we'll talk about yoga nidra, and I will send you guys some resources for yoga nidra. We surround ourselves with and we form nourishing relationships. We form community. And so many people from other cultures would say, the thing women are really missing, and I think that would be such a boon to create a healthy transition from that pitta to vata time of life or through and into menopause, is community. We're missing that community. I don't know how many women's moms or grandmothers were really talking about um, menopause. I think some of us were lucky if we really got a good talk about sex and what was happening in our when we started menstruating, right, when we started our periods. I know some people's moms are really uncomfortable with the subject and like handed them a pamphlet to read. So we're definitely not talking about menopause, right? So it's really important that we form community and start talking about this stuff, and that's one of my goals here. And we want to consume harmonious qualities through our senses. So, smell, aromatherapy, colors. Gold helps build ojas. So, the metal and the color gold, sort of like the sunny yellow color, deep yellow color. Sounds, nature sounds, soothing, uplifting sounds. Taste, right? So, we want to look at how we're eating and what we're eating, and touch. We talked about Abhyanga, that beautiful self oil massage practice. So we want to bring in all these things to harmonize our hormones. These are things that deplete ojas, right? Things that ignore our body's needs. So skipping meals, fasting too much or too often, getting less than 7 hours of sleep on the regular, really strenuous exercise, especially if you're not getting enough sleep because you're not repairing the damage that exercise does and rebuilding the bone and muscle tissue, right? So we've got to sleep, especially if we're doing intense exercise, if that's your jam. Moving too much, moving too quickly throughout our days, right? Overthinking, always problem solving, multitasking, projecting into the future, overworking, neglecting our own self care practices, taking care of everyone else but ourselves, putting ourselves last. This is a big one. Ignoring our gut feelings. As women, we have such a strong ability to be intuitive and to feel and to know what we should or shouldn't do. And when we ignore that, we deplete ourselves, right? We deplete that ojas and that ability to be resilient. Not allowing ourselves, this is one of my kind of big ones, not allowing ourselves adequate recovery from injuries and traumas, including sort of the natural traumas that women experience in their lifetime: childbirth, monthly menses, and death, loss of loved ones that we all experience, not just women, of course. But I think we're not given a lot of time to recover after childbirth. We're lucky if we get, a month or two of leave, maternity leave. I hope that's changing. I think in some ways it is. I see it. We're not given time to rest around our periods. This is a time when our bodies are trying to slough off waste material and shed, and on top of all the other biological processes that have to go on just around digestion every day. So we're not given time to rest, right? We're told, like, put a tampon in and keep going. So I think, and that's part of the women's right empowerment movement, that we're not limited by these things, but we also got to give ourselves a freaking break, right? Um, and so I think that's why a lot of us struggle with so many symptoms around our menstrual cycles. We're just pushing ourselves so hard all the time. And death. Death is something that I don't think our culture, society gives anyone proper time to experience and integrate. And we all do it in such different ways. So just giving ourselves more time when big changes happen in life, whether they're perceived as positive or negative, is so important, instead of just piling more stuff on our plates. And then consuming substances that keep our nervous system upregulated or mask our symptoms, right? Like caffeine, alcohol, drugs, processed food, sugar, things that give us, really strong dopamine hits, to make us think we're feeling good, right? But they're not a replacement for the things that we can really do to nurture ourselves and create more sustainable feel good hormones. And then media, right? That's a big one. I think the news. I'm personally trying to really just not pay attention to much of it these days, and doom scrolling through social media, right? Studies time and time again show that we can start to feel pretty crappy about our lives because of the comparison factor, right? Social media, we're getting just we're getting the highlight reels, right? We're getting the snippet, the good stuff in people's lives, and that's all we see. And it can make us feel inadequate or depleted, because of, again, the comparison factor. So um, these are things that can deplete us, create negative energy, by keeping our minds, our nervous systems, and our organs overly stimulated.